Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome tonight here at this special program organized by Rotterdamse Nieuwe and Dépendance, where you are tonight. This is a very special first time in a series of events where both organizations join forces in discussing contemporary challenges concerning urban development and entrepreneurship as well. Rotterdamse Nieuwe, for those of you who don't know that, is a community for young entrepreneurial Rotterdam, and the Dépendance is a platform for city culture founded by design studio Zus that researches the spatial, economic and political issues of our time by organizing public events like these tonight. The question at hand tonight is, who owns this city? Which means we will explore the radical transformations of ownership in cities. The takeover by, as you will, corporate investors in cities like New York, like London, and, of course, tonight, like Rotterdam. And for that, I think we couldn't have had a better location than this, which is a former Shell tower and is currently under construction and being redeveloped by, of course, again, a foreign investor. Keynote speaker today is Saskia Sassen, one of the most prominent urban thinkers of today, and I think she's the world's leading authority on globalization, migration, and global cities. I think to illustrate her influence and the influence she has had on public debate and urban culture, we only have to think about this term, the global city, in Dutch Wereldstad, that is so widespread, I think, mainly because Saskia Sassen single-handedly coined the term more than 25 years ago. Her latest book is called Expulsions. Some of you might have read it. It's called Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, in which Saskia Sassen states that a rising number of people, enterprises, as well as places are being pushed out of the system. They are kind of expelled. These expulsions are from the core social and economic orders of our time. And according to Sassen, these dislocations, as she calls them, can no longer be understood in terms like poverty or injustice or inequality. But what's going on now, she says, can best be described as a sort of expulsion, which is in Dutch not uitsluiting but uitstoting. And tonight, Saskia Sassen will discuss the question, who owns a city? And she will discuss how these global expulsions, and more specific, the privatization of urban land in cities like, for example, Rotterdam, are about to completely reshape cities as we know them. We will try with her and with you all to find out which powers are key in this development and how this affects Dutch cities and Rotterdam. And of course, because we want to end with a little bit of hope tonight, if there's something we might be able to do about this development. The program is as follows. We have a keynote lecture of 50 minutes, after which we'll have a public discussion of a little bit more than half an hour with you, with a couple of social entrepreneurs from the city of Rotterdam who are here tonight. My name is Geert Maars, I will be your host, and I will try to find you with a microphone if you have a question after the lecture by Saskia Sassen. And it's my honor to introduce her to you tonight. She is the Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University, where she also chairs the Committee on Global Thought. She is in Rotterdam a member of the International Advisory Board for the City of Rotterdam, and she has published numerous books, including A Sociology on Globalization, The Global City, and recent Expulsions that were translated in over 20 languages. And she's a regular contributor to the public debate as well in popular media as Le Monde, for example, or the New York Times or the Huffington Post. She was, I think for the people who have read it yesterday, described in the Volkskrant in a big interview of, I think, 4 or 5 pages long. You haven't seen it yet, okay. Described as the female version of Thomas Piketty, but we think that's a kind of ridiculous comparison, and her influence is obviously much bigger. And we are very proud to have her here tonight. Please welcome Saskia Sassen.
Okay, so I can hear this. Well, You are very tall, but now I see why. I also feel tall tonight. I'm actually very short. So, well, it's a pleasure for me to be here. And I know that Sunday is not the usual day, but I'm between Madrid and Ankara, and this was my day. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful that this could happen, also for the organizers. Now, I appreciate your introduction. You are a bit more vehement than I am, believe it or not. I'm known as a vehement person. So this question of who owns the city, for me, is an emergent condition. And what we're talking when who owns the city is really a kind of owner that is now scaling up in a way that we have not seen in the recent past, let's say since World War II. There might have been epochs way, way many centuries ago when we had that kind of scale up. But it is an emergent condition. And so it raises for me a question, do we have the language that we need to understand this? So one side project I'm doing is looking at the legal order about ownership of urban land, not buildings. See, we tend to, when somebody buys something in a city, the buying is of a building. And I want to move deeper. I want to understand who actually owns urban land, because that is a far more radical level. And so I'm working with legal scholars in places as diverse as Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Joburg, because this is happening in many places. I'm just looking at the 100 cities which are the top recipients of this type of large-scale investment. Mind you, which is often an investment that doesn't have an immediate, at least visible, utility function. Often it's just sitting there. So there is something happening that invites me to think that we need to develop categories to capture what is happening. I, by the way, think the same about the question of the so-called migration crises in Europe. I think that the language of the migrant, the immigrant, the refugee captures something. But I do think that we are witnessing an emergent new history. A massive loss of habitat due to land grabs, water grabs, mining, desertification, flooding, a whole variety, with war the most extreme case. So to me, this is a very particular period. Really, it's a period that begins to take shape in the most, like the United States and certain types of countries, about 30 years ago. It just now is taking on very extreme forms that make visible its difference. And so that is sort of a bit what I want to address. So it really is partly an inquiry. It's not that I'm ready to line up all the grabbers and shoot them down. It's not. I'm not at that point. This is something that we need to understand what is happening, and we need to contest it. I do believe that. Now, I want to frame this in a certain way, and it is a notion that we make. This is clearly a partial account. We don't make. It's not just about making. I don't mean, by the way, the makers movement. That is not what I mean. And so we made this. This is extraordinary. I don't know if people can see it. We destroyed the Aral Sea in 20 years. Look at that. From being this, one of the biggest... Oopsie, where is my mic? I was going to have a microphone so I could walk around. Okay, doesn't matter. And to this, that, I say, is a capability. It's a negative one. It's not an Amartya Sen capability. But boy, how did we manage that? What are all the complex systems that had to get together to produce this disaster? And of course, this is another version, right? Millions of years. And we, poof, in 20 years, gone. The ice cover. So I say this to sort of invite ourselves to think the capabilities that we've been able to develop. The we here clearly is slightly rhetorical, slightly ambiguous, slightly who knows what. But I just want to emphasize that in direct and indirect ways, with many different systems coming together, we have made massive transformations. They have regrettably mostly gone in the direction of negatives. Oops, I don't need this. I can see that I'm going to be like a juggler. So the one question that I like to use also to frame matters is, are we actually living through the emergence and the constituting, the emergence might have been a while ago, of a new systemics, that something is different, that certain aspects make visible a partial, outcome, like this corporate buying of urban land that I'm going to be talking about. But that actually is more widespread. There are more benign versions, and there are actually even more extreme versions, like with high finance, I would argue, than with the question of corporate acquisitions of property. Now, when you look at this, I just want to point out a few thingies here. So this is corporate profits after tax, and I'm taking the United States. So 1940s, we don't need to bother with this. Here, this is when I was beginning to work on the global city notion. It begins to grow in a very marked way. Look at this growth. This is incredible, the sharpness of this curve. Then it goes down, and this is what matters. After the crises, which lasted about 2 hours for these, actors, I exaggerate, it was a few years. But look at that. After that, even higher. That is an important indicator. Now, at the same time, most of the rest of the country was losing. The middle class really shrank. So if you look, for instance, in the United States, when the new jobs begin to be created, well, let me backtrack. With the crises, 65% of middle class jobs are lost. The new jobs that we have made up till now, only 25% are middle class jobs. The others are very high or very low. So these are all indications of a systemic transformation. This is even more acute. So here it goes. Here the crisis lasts half an hour. And then without shame, it goes further up. Now, this is fed by a whole bunch of dynamics. And one of them is, I don't know if people heard, but Bloomberg News put in a freedom of information. It took to our central bank, the Fed, that took almost 3 years for our central bank to release the data. That is very dodgy. If a dodgy firm takes 3 years, but this is the central bank, supposedly one of the best in the world, one of the most serious ones, I don't know what all. Well, that showed that secretly $7.7 trillion had been passed, which doesn't mean that they just took the money. It means also, a version of quantitative easing, you print. 7.7 trillion to the global banking system to rescue it. So part of this added profits also comes from that venue. But $7.7 trillion is a lot of money, a vast amount of dollars. We debated in Congress, a very good debate, whether we should pass on to the banks 320 billion. That was a big debate, open debate, like, can we give them 320 billion? In the meantime, behind our backs, so to speak, our central bank passed on 7.7 trillion. So those things don't fall from the sky ready-made. They are constituted by a whole variety of... So I'm just giving you sort of a broader landscape of what we're talking about here. Now, I just want to... I needed to... So I want to show something about finance, which I think shows it to be a capability. Finance is not about money. Finance, traditional banking is about money. It sells money for an interest rate. Finance sells something it doesn't have. And therein lies its brilliance, because it has to develop instruments that allow it to invade any sector, rich, poor, doesn't matter, to financialize. And of course, therein lies also its danger, that it is invading. It can work with student loans, for instance. Now student loans in the United States have reached $1 trillion. So hey, for the finance, $1 trillion, real money, not derivatives based on whatever, actual cash, my God, the rare thing. We can work with that. I hope you're following my English. Okay, good. So here is one little bit of finance. Wrong tool. So look at this. This is 201 under a trillion. 6 years later, 2007, 62 trillion. Now, this is a famous thing which helped to create the crisis, etc. But I just want to focus on something else. So when I see these numbers, I need to sort of interrogate them, interpolate them. So I ask, well, what does this actually mean? So let me ask, at that point in 2007, when the crisis is really starting, what was global GDP, the GDP of all the countries, including China? Well, it was 54 trillion. Ooh, well, finance very easily surpasses GDP. So that is not. But then I ask myself, well, what is these 62 trillion, which is just credit default swaps, in total finance? Well, it turns out that total finance at that point was about 600 trillion. Now then you say GDP, 54 trillion, global GDP, finance 600 trillion as measured by outstanding derivatives, which is the basic measure. Then you begin to say, wow, well, this cannot simply be about money, but let me check it. So I check it. How do I check it? I ask, well, what is the value of all the currencies issued by all the central banks, not all the currencies issued by all the central banks in the world. In other words, what we call, regular, an exchangeable medium to some extent. Well, at that point, it was about 250 trillion. Now, then you begin to see, when you have that much of a gap, that finance is a capability. We name all it does in monetary terms, but it is something else. Huh? Now, the reason I'm giving you this stuff is that at some point, the system can no longer handle this amount of almost speculative, it's derivatives based on interest rates, based on other derivatives, it's chains. And so in that sense, this move towards buying urban land and rural land, urban land, urban property and rural land, is not totally unconnected to this extraordinary explosion in value, which then, of course, begins to collapse after 2007 and 2008, not all of it, by the way. Today, finance, however, has recovered beautifully. I mean, we did help it with 7.7 trillion, so which for them, that's like raw matter, as opposed to derivatives on interest rates, and it can multiply effects. So today, it's well over a quadrillion. So yes, it suffered a bit with it. Huh? It's a bit ambiguous, not sure what it can do, but it's still a very, very powerful factor. Now, so here let me then, having given you this sort of background, this question of who owns the city. Now, this is a provocative question, because it's not clear who owns the city. It's an interesting question to me. I began to ask myself this question, and I'm doing this project I mentioned already, because I think somehow we need to ask it. I like to interrogate a current period, a current development. That doesn't mean that I'm going to come out with all the answers, but at least I want to ask from our historic moment, what am I seeing? So putting it in that way, which is a very extreme way of putting it, is one way of engaging, one way that guides me to understand, okay, what are we really seeing here? What is it that we're talking about? Now, here I wanted to show you some figures. Now, this is a list of 100 cities, but clearly, it would have to go all over the ceiling there. So we just have a few here. Now, this is, as you see, this is total national and foreign investment in property. In other words, we're not talking site development. We are just speaking about buying property. And it's both national and foreign. In the case of New York, it's mostly national. In the case of London, it's mostly foreign. In the case of Tokyo, it's mostly national. In the case of Los Angeles, probably all the Paris, a lot of foreign. I don't know if anybody saw it. I just did a piece on who owns Paris in La Tribune, in French. And they gave me 2 pages, to show the data, because a lot of the French, say, urbanists are absolutely not aware that this is happening, but there is a lot. The Kazakhstanis are buying, it's from all sort of a whole Asian region. Now, I want to emphasize 2 points here. First, this is just property buying. This is not site development. That is a totally different issue. That is also happening. But just to keep a bit of clarity, and partly also because this leads more directly to the question of what is the legal regime for urban land, or for urban property. I mean, who really owns that land beneath all those buildings? Now here you can see it's sort of a different type of distribution. So you see, here you get many more, but it's still, just what is it? It's still not the whole list. And you can see that you have a whole set of cities here. Now, I am struck by how many on this list are American cities, which is probably a function of the data, by the way. That we don't have as much, many countries are not as transparent as, say, the United States might be, or these particular countries that we're seeing here that dominate. I don't know that, but I'm trying to find out. And what has happened, so then let me just show you the next year, because I have that here, I think. So this is just a foreign property. And here you see that London absolutely dominates. And here, see Amsterdam, I was very struck by Amsterdam here. And also you have to look at the rate. You see the rate of increase, much higher for Amsterdam than for New York and London, and what's the other one here, and Paris. So that to me, that really struck me. Now, it's Randstad, it's Amsterdam Randstad, and I don't know exactly what, I'm trying to find out how much is Amsterdam and how much is outside Amsterdam. And if anybody has data, it just would be great to share that, in the discussion, etc. Now, again, here, if you look at what it looks like, when you take it longer, you see how extreme the top cities are. When you look at the full 100, you tend to see that after that it sort of becomes very, very regular even, but much smaller. However, the rates of growth are like that, like 400%, in some cases. They are really quite high. So it's spreading. The suggestion that I hear from people who are in the business is that there is a kind of trend now that has just emerged to privilege the top cities. Now, I wanted to go back a minute to London. So London is a very good example. It's mostly foreign. And many people say, well, this is gentrification. And back to the language question. Of course it is also gentrification. But gentrification is not enough to capture it. And so if you just use the term gentrification, it's sort of an invitation not to think. So let me give you an example that I love to mention. So the Qatari royals, and I don't have anything against them, unlike their neighbors down there. The Qatari royals own more of central London now than the Queen of England. Pace, big footnote. The main owner, private big owner, is a duke, not the Queen of England. But the Queen of England owns quite a bit as well. So when you're dealing with two such rich actors, to flatten that into gentrification means that you're losing too much. These are other histories in the making. And there is also gentrification, which is displacing people, etc., etc. But yes, gentrification, but something else. And I'm not totally clear what that something else is. One of the categories that I enjoy the most developing, is territory. And I'm just very interested in examining this new way of establishing ownership in these cities, as also involving the making of new types of territories. For me, territory is a very complex category. It's a combination of embedded power, the state, and embedded is an example, but there are other examples. To what extent can that become these owners? And at the same time, embedded logics of claim making. So thinking about these projects not simply as they're buying property, but trying to get at some deeper layer, which I don't know exactly, where that goes. I'm sort of in that research. Now, so somebody did this slide for me. I would never have used such big letters. What does this all look like? My God, I'm innocent. Anyhow, but the slide is very interesting. look at this. So this is just taking Chinese properties. There was a barrage. These are all, most of them are very distinguished buildings that most Londoners or Brits are not aware that the Chinese have bought them. You know, these are all sort of, what do you call it when you cannot change it? You know, they're protected by the law. I think most of them. And look at that. And this is just the most glamorous ones. So this is just, to me, a very concrete way. And again, the fact, I really personally don't think that the fact that it is foreign or national makes a difference. I really don't. But please, if you disagree with me, I would love to hear what it is. I think ultimately this is corporate. That is really what we're seeing. Well, let me see, I can't remember. Oh, right. And then I just wanted to mention that the Chinese, and again, the Chinese are just buying a lot, so they come up, but there are about 30 nationalities that are big buyers. So, but the Chinese have bought, this is site development now, this is not property buying. They have bought Atlantic Yards in New York. I don't know if anybody knows that place. So it's one of the biggest patches of land that is, from the perspective of developers, underdeveloped. So what does it have? It has a lot of artist studios because the artists had to leave Manhattan because Manhattan became too expensive. It has a lot of what I think of as urban manufacturing, a manufacturing that is geared towards urban service industries, the opera, the museums, etc., etc. So a very useful function, you understand, very important. I call it urban man. That was my term, right? It's an inversion of the historical relationship between manufacturing and services, which was that the services were there to service the manufacturing sector. But now we have this other thing, and that's a profoundly urban type of manufacturing. And like fancy designer lamp makers and I don't know what, that kind of stuff. It's very, very important for the city. And the opera, for instance, you know, with the divas, they have to know they can't have. So a lot of that stuff has to be made right there in situ. You can't outsource it to the other end of the world. You know, they have to breathe and sing and look tightly dressed, the divas I'm talking about, not me. And so, you know, I have sort of examined the broad range of issues that come up. And today I'm very interested in cities and how the leadership understands this role of urban manufacturing. It is a different type of manufacturing. Again, this historic inversion. Now, so back to the Chinese. So the Chinese bought this huge plot of land, which is called Atlantic Yards. They decided that they're going to throw out everything that is there. It will be a battle, but you know they'll probably succeed. And they're going to replace it with 14 massive towers, which is, I was going to say, this is such bad taste in this case. This is one. 14, huge. In other words, they're going to be adding density, right? Before it was mostly low rise, etc. But they're actually de-urbanizing. I will argue, and I will develop that argument of mine. But so here, just to wrap up a bit, the top 100 cities by property investment, again, not site development, are 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, but 76% of property investment, whether national or global. Now, strictly speaking, I'm not sure exactly what this means, this 76%. I mean, I buy the figure, though. It's difficult. But I don't know if this is a horror. Oh, my God, that it's all happening in those top 100 cities, or whether that somehow is to be expected. I'm not quite there. You know, I have to figure that one out. Now, I want to go back to a blank slide. And I want to, I'm like a craftsman doing their craft right in front of you, right? I'm sort of mixing it all up. But so why does this all matter? You know, this is a question that when I do my research, I have to ask myself, why does it matter? Why does, like, especially the sort of this great building, this raising the density? And here, let me just sort of share with you some of my views about the city. Why does the city matter? why does all of this matter that I'm describing to you, right? I mean, cities have gone through so many transformations. And so number one, for me, the city, if I have a definition for the city, and I need always, when I define something, to go to the non-X. Huh? So if I'm talking about the city, I need to find something that is so far away that I have to rediscover the city. That in that way I can see it suddenly. Huh? So for me, the city is a complex but incomplete system. And in that mixture of complexity and incompleteness lies the capacity of the city to outlive all kinds of far more powerful systems, but closed systems. Kingdoms, governments, corporations. Think most corporations that were ever created are dead. But the cities where they operated are still there. So that's one point to put on the table. That, to me, is a very interesting issue. So at some point, I said it in passing, you may raise the density, but if you're actually de-urbanizing that space, you are robbing it from that capacity to have a very long life and traverse so many different historical epochs. So, and the second point that really, when I want to just go back to what is the absolute ground level that, why does it matter? And I say, well, if we look at history, and I'm just talking about the histories of several major cities, mostly in the West, probably Latin America, Europe, some in Africa, some in Asia, but not every city, clearly. The city is a place where those without power get to make a history, an economy, a culture. And most people in cities, who live in cities, are modest income or poorish. So this is very important. If a modest person, if a low-income person is working in an office park, is the term office park familiar? You have a lot of, that is extremely dense, but it tends to be privately owned, and you go in there, you do your job, and then you're out. You don't get to make a history, a culture, or an economy in that kind of work situation. Where in a larger city, you will have the immigrant communities, et cetera, et cetera. And third point, it seems to me that today, so much of what we call power, but especially economic power, is actually highly intermediated. It's not like the old bourgeoisies, at the turn of the century, at late 1800s and early 1900s, where the bourgeoisie built beautiful buildings because it was its space of representation, where it projected itself. Today, that is not the case. It's just not. And so power is actually very, very removed, very, very abstract. By intermediated, I mean that, before you get to the actual people can take a lot of, And so the city is actually one place where power, that kind of economic power, becomes concrete, men and women who want it all and get it all. It's a site of engagement. So when I ask myself, where's the frontier today? The frontier. And which in the past was at the edges of empire, right? Today, I think the only frontier space that we have, real frontier space, is in our big cities, big messy cities, not neat, sort of bigger cities that cannot be fully controlled. And I think of the frontier as a space where actors from different worlds have an encounter for which there are no established rules of engagement. In other words, the powerless and powerful encounter each other in our cities, either through the employment vector or because we're going to the same shops, etc., etc. So it's a very interesting space. And final point, I think that the cosmopolitanism of our cities, those cities that are cosmopolitan, very often is rooted, actually, in the fact that there is an incredible diversity of thick cultures, often, immigrant cultures, but it doesn't have to be that. And these, these thick, distinctive cultures, music, clothing, food, sound, whatever, all smells. Even they take a long trip inside the city and eventually go to the center, to the elites. And there they become cleansed. And then suddenly it's cosmopolitanism. I cannot think of one city today that we think of as cosmopolitan that has not had diversities of thick cultures. Now, the thick cultures themselves are not necessarily cosmopolitan, but they are they're ingredients. So when I think of urban space, or when I think of the city, I think of something that is extremely important on so many different vectors. I mean, it's also, just to give you a framing image, I grew up in Latin America, and so the fighting poor in Latin America have this phrase, estamos presentes. We're present. We're not asking you for anything powerful, whatever. We're just letting you know we're here. This is also our city. So that kind of stuff, to me, these are all elements, if you want, that make me quite sure, quite certain, that some of this corporatizing of the city, which takes, greater density, etc., can actually de-urbanize. And the importance of distinguishing density. Not all densities urbanize. Some do. I mean, we need a bit of density in a city. Now, so I want to just a bit more on what's happening in these cities, right? So inventing new housing markets. I talk about this, about all these things also in my book, but certainly about this. So this is a super prime housing market. This is an invented market. It's the Nobel Prize winner who got, about 3 or 4 years ago, got the Nobel for matched markets. These are markets where actors know who needs what they have. This is what this is. It sets a minimum price. The minimum price de facto right now is closer to 100 million very often. So that creates, a super value issue, pure profit, and many of those properties are not worth it. So here you have just some examples, and look at the different nationalities also that are involved. So Dubai is quite different from the others. So it captures, but again, these are extremely international sites. I'm sorry that not everybody can see these numbers, but now here are photos. This is a Guardian photographer who managed to get into some of these properties are empty. They're just buying. It's like storing your money. I mean, this took quite a bit of time to get to this state. There is another photo that I have of a property owned by the Saudis, which now has a tree growing inside the living room. I swear nobody has been in there for I don't know how long, but also this, and also this. I mean, can you see this? This looks very strange. Can you see what this is? These are steps covered with moss. That takes years, I think, to get there. So the rich in California, like Beverly Hills, like not to see any people. The rich in London, where some of these properties are, they are complaining. I did a story with the Financial Times where I pretended, that I was walking my dog or whatever in one of these areas, and I ran into some Brits walking their dogs. It's a very good, and I recommend it if you're interested in ethnographies, walk your dog wherever you want to, And but you have to know what dog you have with you. Not one of these dogs like in New York. We have dogs where they are like as a horse, and they are terrifying, more terrifying than a gun. Anyhow, and I asked, and this person basically wound up saying, it's getting so empty here. There are no people on the street. I love that, by the way. These are very rich, very elite, and the opposite of Beverly Hills. Again, sort of different cultures. Now, this is something that I also have discussed further. This is a financial instrument. The point that I want to get at is that 14 million households. This is in the United States, mostly in a limited number of cities. 14 million households wound up, according to our Fed, according to Bernanke, he said that when he stepped down, thrown out of their houses. That has left a lot of empty urban land. Not always in the most desirable cities, but still. And again, in this context, when I put it all together, I see, wow, what's next for all these empty places? So here you have, these are annual numbers. Now, foreclosure is a notice. But according to the central bank, the central banks are research institutions. Most of these people wound up, and as you see, 2014, for those who see it, so yet another million were filed. So when Bernanke, now I step out of this bit, when Bernanke stepped down as the head of the Fed in New York, he said, long, whatever, blah, blah. And then he said, and there are two issues that we do not know how to handle. One of them is this. So he then pronounces and he says, over 14 million households will have lost their houses by the end of 2014. He stepped down in the middle of 2014. The other thing he said was up to 70% of financial trading takes place in dark pools. That was his language, not mine. Dark pools. So these are private networks. And he also said, we don't really know exactly what is going on in there. I thought those were two very interesting comments. Now, back to this. Europe thinks it doesn't have this problem. That instrument is also traveling. And so you have, the worst hit is Hungary, which has had, and again, these are households. The numbers are much smaller. So a household, can be up to 4 people. By the way, in the United States, the estimate is 14 million households, but 30 million people. And sort of coming back to a more theoretical point that I keep making in my expulsions book, this is invisible. You have to imagine this geography. You can't see the 30 million people being thrown out. You just can't see it. So much materiality, but they sort of disappear in the woodwork of people on the street. I don't mean homeless, just, whatever, or people. You just cannot see 30 million people. It's like twice the population of the Netherlands. It's as if some God voice were there and said, okay, everybody on the territory of the Netherlands, out. And now we're going to repeat that exercise. It's almost, I often mention that story because it makes it sort of Pythagorean. Huh? You can actually sense the numbers. But these are, and so anyhow, and Germany, a healthy economy, is one of the highest, is among the highest foreclosure rates, etc. Now, in the case of Hungary, we know that 1 million plus households have lost their home. The reason for bringing this kind of stuff up, the foreclosures in the US and here, is because this is leaving a lot of empty urban land, albeit with modest little houses, mostly very modest little houses, which can be erased like that, no problem. We're not talking big buildings necessarily. Now, so why does all of this matter? I already answered to you, right? Why this city, etc., etc. This P is a mistake, okay? The correct word is not capacity. Oh, wow. So sort of a wrapping up in terms of all that I already said about the city, etc., is that the city enables us for moments, maybe every day, but it's a momentary thing, to become urban subjects. Not racial, not income-wise, poor, rich, not whatever, ethnicity or religion, but urban subjects. And I love this image. I say that there are moments in the daily routines of a city when we're all urban subjects. Doesn't matter who we are. When the city can hack all the other specific subjects, we also are. And one of these is, of course, rush hour traffic. We all, at least when you have public transport, rich, poor, super, super rich are another caste, I would say. But we are all urban subject. In a moment to try, we have got to get the train. So I'm trying to get a very simple example here, but something that is, to me, very interesting. It's not so easy to generate the urban subject. We so easily fall back into, So the capacity of urban space to have speech, to hack, all these other, and just to produce, that to me. Now, I want to end up, how am I doing on time? You're not tracking. That's good. Very good. All right. So my clock, I just don't remember when I started. That's my problem. So I want to end up with something else that also gets me back to this question of it really matters that we keep our cities as this complex but incomplete, etc., capacity to make urban subjects. And I don't know how many of you saw, I have often shown this map in the United States also, and almost nobody has ever seen it. It is in the public domain, okay? How it got to the public domain is another matter, but it is in the public domain. So how many people here have seen this map? Did you see it from one of my presentations? No, you saw it, okay. Often people say, yeah. So this is up to 10,000 buildings now, really, that are full-time gathering data. So I'm going to talk a bit about the surveillance bit, because I also think that with this kind of apparatus and the new kinds of legislation or quasi-legislation that is being passed, also in Europe, as you know. I don't know about the Netherlands, but this is very serious stuff. So if your grandmother was visiting there, hanging out with whatever in New York or somewhere, she's in the data set. Number two, the logic of this system, and I don't think it's that different. Maybe the French are a bit better than the Americans, I would hope, on their surveillance thing. But the logic is that for our security, we the citizens are all suspect. They're gathering data on all of us. 1 million plus people with top clearance, security clearance. Very weird system that they have to gather. And then final point, we know from whatever facts, the way they use all of this stuff, 10 minutes, oops. The way that we use all of this stuff is that when they find somebody through good traditional prejudice, looks like a Muslim, whatever it might be, right? Then they go into this data set. You understand how irrational this is? I don't know if I conveyed that. Now, I want to move on and to get, so I'm now going to talk a bit about data that we have. It's in the public domain. It got to the public domain. Thank you, Mr. Snowden and a few others. Who's dangerous? Look at this. This is the United States government. Veterans. I mean, is this tragic or what? They sent them to war and then they... Environmentalists. Well, that is not as bad as what I'm going to show you now, which is what we know. And I'm not going, this is not about reading it. Huh? This is just a sense of long lists. I mean, you can read in between. What we know the NSA can do to get at information. For instance, a very famous case is that many people think if my computer is off, they can get into it. Ha ha, yes, they can. Radio waves, So there is, I mean, you learn, I'm leaving these slides, so people, those of you who are really interested, you get and check it out. So we know all of this. Now look at some of these things. It can track communication within media organizations like Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, of course, is quite protective of its information. This is even better. It can hack into the UN video conferencing system. I mean, what is this? Anyhow. So, and then more. It's so mindless. I mean, you can't believe it. So, and just now, you know that the Europeans, that actually happened a while ago. So they are doing that too. Okay, I'm just going to end without an ending. Thank you very much.
I have the first question to you. You already mentioned a couple of examples of the people who are expelled, the people who got thrown out of their houses, the artist in New York who had to make room for the big ugly Chinese towers. Can you give us a sort of idea of the other examples, or how do we recognize the people who are victim of these expulsions?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of it, there are two vectors. One is that you buy, the corporations buy property that exists, often modest property, and then tear it down and build a high-rise. So in Manhattan, for instance, you can see it, you walk out in Lower Manhattan, and you see these huge towers, and often they are like, they call them pencil buildings, very, very narrow because there's almost no space, but by God, there they are building a multiple. Recently we had a terrible accident these construction sites are extraordinary. So we usually wouldn't see them, but now they are right there. It's really worthwhile to go to one of them. I don't know if that is also happening in the Netherlands, but you can actually see them. And once, not too long ago, one of these cranes fell, and that was catastrophic. They had a very hard time fixing that problem because they're surrounded by other buildings. So that's the extreme case, right? But what you see in London very, very, very clearly also is tearing down a lot of urban tissue. Because London is chock full of stuff. Very, very low rise, occupies a huge surface, but has this nodal, these boroughs that have a high street. I think the Netherlands has that kind of thing too, that even if it is a neighborhood, it has a bit of a center. I love that. It's not like in the United States, it's very difficult to get that. I remember when my mother came to see me when I was at university in the US, and I knew that she was urban, etc. And so I brought her to the city next to my university. And we stood there, and she said, "But where is the city?" She couldn't see the city in what she was seeing, though it was somewhat denser. So what you have, I think London is a very extreme case. Paris is becoming extreme, where you tear down a lot of tissue, because they are dense cities but low-rise cities, and then you see these new productions coming up. But you also see empty houses, what I showed you. Not so much. But at night, for instance, I like to go at night, people are doing this now, to these new high-rise apartment buildings in New York and in London. Those are two extreme cases. And all the windows are dark. Nobody's living in there. In some cases, there were like 3 people maybe living in there, and they were saying, "I'm moving out, I'm so alone here." Because it's horrible to be in a huge building. So this is a very weird moment. That is why I was saying at the start also, in some ways it's like storing money. And my big question is this actually buying urban land? How do you buy urban land in today? Mostly through buildings in a city. So, and if it is a buying of urban land, here is one concern that I have. This is part of my research project with the lawyers. Because there's no clear law in most cities about who owns the land. I think that's interesting. I would be very interested in how that is in the Netherlands. So that one concern is that the contracts that are being developed for foreign or national corporates to buy up a building or a big site in a city, that those contracts may contain then or may become the source for developing urban land law. And I'm also working with a prof at Harvard University, Jeffrey Frug, who is one of the few urban land legal experts. And he also, when I started on this project, he said, "I don't know where you're going to go with that, because we just don't think that way. We have law to do what happens on the top of the land." And so, well, anyhow, I'm just giving you a second lecture. I'm sorry, I should stop talking, but,
but
I'm having a conversation with you all, yes.
If you have any question, please do raise your hand, and I will try to find you. I will come to you. But before that, I have one more other question.
Yes.
Sorry for that. For me, it's kind of hard to understand who we are talking about. You try to explain the people who are expelled. In the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned you're not in the stage yet that you are able to pinpoint the bad guys, the grabbers. Will there be a point where you might be able to?
Well, we know who's buying. I have that information. That is my concern, that they are potentially making the new urban law, which is going to work to their advantage in a way. No, what I was saying is I don't know exactly what I am seeing. I feel that also, as I said about the migration crisis, but that's the theorist in me. I don't want to simply accept the self-evident. I want to go digging. I want to see what am I really seeing here. So that is a bit maybe elusive, for you. But I don't want to stay at this level. This is just an indication of something. But what it actually means, because it also depends on where the economy goes next. If it is indeed the case that the economy, and say also the financial sector, that it's a bit stuck, as many people are saying, right? I mean, we have growth and all of that. Then this might actually really become the storing of money. We're talking big capital. Even if you build a building, where whatever, you may have to, in some cases, build it. You can't just own a property and not do something with it or whatever. But that, who knows where it goes next? But I'm just, as I said, I'm just interested in this question of urban land. And of course, in there, the reason I'm interested in all of this is because of what I said about the city. It's an extremely important space in the history of so many people. The city is a very, very special space, especially for those without much power, which is most people, even in our rich cities. In New York City, over 50% of the people who live in New York City are beneath the poverty line. I mean, it's this sort of duality, right? So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I really, this to me is data. Huh? And then I need to know, am I seeing the beginning of a process that will have to do with urban land? Now, partly I'm doing that because I'm also looking at rural land grabs, as we call them, which has been also quite something. By the way, there is also buying of land happening in Europe, especially Eastern and Central Europe, but also France. A lot of rural land, farmland, where you could farm, has been bought up. One way that we found out was that the sons and daughters of former farmers who couldn't get good jobs in France decided, let me go back to farming. They could not find land to buy. In the UK, vast stretches of land have been bought. And in Cambridge, where Cambridge University is, one of the biggest buyers is the Mormons of Utah. Utah, you know what I mean? Utah is a very dry state. Maybe they are in search of wet land. I don't know. But when you begin to look at the stuff, and when you see who is buying, because I didn't quite show, the long list, there are, as I said, about 30 countries, and they are extremely varied. A lot of the Central Asian countries are buying, So I just want to look at this bigger picture. And at the heart of it is this notion, are we going to see the privatizing of urban land the way we are seeing the privatizing of other elements, that used to be sort of more public domain? For instance, Potsdamer Platz, I mean, you all know this, right? Potsdamer Platz used to be the ultimate public space. They rebuilt it, etc. The streets in Potsdamer Platz are private. Many people don't know that. They only find out when they do something, and then they can come, the guards, say, you cannot do that here. So stuff, as they say in America, stuff is happening. But, that is why I'm interested. If it were just to document, that's not enough. I don't know if I've answered your...
Yeah, okay, but one more last question from
Sure.
me then. To give me and everybody here a concrete idea, if this will continue in with this speed you are noticing right now, where will we? It won't only be Potsdamer Platz. It might be the total city of Berlin or Rotterdam in private hands. Where will we be in 50 years? How does our city or our daily life look like then?
50?
Or 20
well, 50,
or 30 or 150?
50, I don't know. But no, so here are elements that we have already seen. So when somebody develops a mega project means eliminating urban tissue. Little streets, little squares, little government office where some older people, that was like a little home for them where they could go talk and get their benefit. A lot of urban stuff, that it's already being eliminated. Now, it's not clear, like I've checked it in New York. Now, New York is a bit the Wild West, but how do they get the right? one thing is to right to build, on a patch of land that you own, but another thing is that you're going to build something so big that you have to eliminate public domain if you want. So this is happening. This is happening in London, and people are really, it's really becoming a bit of a cause. It's something that people are organizing around. And it's certainly happening in New York. It's happening in San Francisco. It's happening in Los Angeles. This something is taking place that really is privatizing stretches of urban land that used to have public space in them. And so one project that I'm doing with the French, it doesn't matter who, but they have asked me to. I have this project going on the street. I'm really interested in the street, partly because of all of this. And so I call it the global street to make it a bit abstract, And so is it my street? No, the global street. And the reason the street, because I think that one of the things that we are really at risk of losing is indeterminacy. I'm really interested in indeterminacy. And so the street, not the piazza, not the boulevard, which have sort of embedded codes of what you do, what you don't do. And some people, I know that some, say, immigrants wouldn't go to a certain park, though the park is public. Because, it's not their park, really. It's for that other kind of people. And so the streetness, la calle. I love it in Spanish. The straat, my Dutch, die Straße. I don't know, to me that is a word that I'm really interested in. We sort of never think, it's not a word that invites you to think when you say the street. I mean, the street. And I want to engage it, because I think that it is one window into, how shall I put it, stuff that is happening. Don't you like stuff? Do we have a Dutch word for stuff?
Spullen.
Spullen. Very, very good tone in which you said that. Spullen. Spullen. There you go.
Shall we go to the first question?
Yeah, of course.
Can you stand up and introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hi, I'm Jan Miller. I'm a student of philosophy. So first of all, I think maybe a remark that might be of interest to you as an example of what you mentioned of certain deals between private companies, or half private in this case, and governments setting a precedent for how the law will be filled in, is the Earthbach Deal that happened earlier, I think this year in Rotterdam, where Woonstads bought off the Earthbach for 100 years. And part of the deal that they made with the municipal government was that they got to earmark how part of the money was spent, that the government got.
How the government
Yes,
was
so
spending.
they said, it was very vaguely stipulated, of course, that it would be used for urban development and specifically like the cleanliness of the streets and stuff like that. But they did obviously get a seat at the table as for how that money was spent.
Well, that captures exactly, there are many different versions of that.
Yeah.
But,
So, sorry, that was not my actual question. So, my actual question was if you would agree with my assessment that, because you mentioned that there might be a shortcoming of the language and the terms that we use, the concepts, that when you talk about something as a financial instrument, somehow misleading because an instrument implies a subject that is consciously somehow using and shaping the world in however they see fit. So as in the bourgeoisie that kind of projects itself. But now what we have are more financial, I suppose, mechanisms or financial functions that basically function because of the fact that they have a certain economic value. And if you agree with that assessment, do you see any possibility to maybe occlude the loss of subjectivity and historical subjectivity of actual people in favor of this kind of blind instrumental process?
Yes and yes.
Okay,
How's
thanks.
that?
Next question.
No. I was going to say, and also no for the first one, and I'll tell you why. Because I do think I have really examined the development of instruments, tools, complex instruments. This is the math of physics, physicists, you know. It is not algorithmic math. It has nothing to do with microeconomics. Finance has nothing to do with microeconomics. And so I love this image also that, say, Goldman Sachs, you know, big financial firm, right? We'll know. Okay. So the back room is a language that is the room where the secretaries used to sit. Well, today the number has declined a bit, but at the height of this financial boom, there were over 100 physicists sitting there. I love physicists, but after 30, many of them, everybody here excluded maybe, they don't know, you know, and so they love making these very complex instruments. Those are really instruments. Second point, I examined it in terms of the subprime mortgage. That was a brilliant instrument to absolutely extract what you need. And for me, by the way, finance, I didn't quite say it. This is when I'm going a bit theoretical. Finance is basically an extractive industry, whereas traditional banking is a commercial thing. You sell something. You sell money. But finance is not about that. Finance extracts, and just like mining, so to speak, when it has extracted and left nothing there, it moves on, right? So I develop all of this stuff in my expulsions book. So I think that, yes, they're instruments, they're not simply tools. And the way people get treated, because it doesn't matter. You see, when mass consumption is the ordering sector, the sector that can make new orderings, like after World War II is a good example, but it already started actually before the wars. Every household, every individual's consumption capacity mattered. So you wanted to keep it going, you wanted to expand it, etc. Mass consumption today, of course, still exists, but it's not the sector that can make new orderings. Finance has been that sector, you know, a certain kind of corporatizing of stuff. And so with finance, you know, it extracts, it destroys like those 30 million people out. It doesn't matter. If mass consumption is the main logic, it does matter. You want to enable. This is the period when you try to really enhance. The system was a systemic condition. It depended a bit on governments, of course, but it was also systemic. Huh? So I do think that, and partly you're right with what you say. I agree. I liked what you said. But I also think that finance should be seen as instrumental. Now, patch all of this, I also say, you know, if finance can make that kind of money, you know, we always use money to what I said, you know. Well, what we need to do, let's bring it down at that moment and materialize it into, you know, social housing, green transport systems, cleaning up toxic dumps. But that has not happened. See, this is also what, so I say, okay, if I look at finance as capability, a variable at this end extremely destructive, but at this end, a question mark. If it can create values that no other economic sector can create, and we name them in money, let's bring it down at that moment. Now that is where political classes and, you know, well-informed politicians could intervene. So I have a kind of ironic take also on this, you know. No other sector can make money that way. So let's bring it down. But if we don't bring it down, then, you know, it just goes on its own. So anyhow, that was a long answer to your very, very good question.
Are there any more questions about the theory? Because I also want to address the implication your ideas have for Rotterdam. About the city of Rotterdam, you haven't been here that long today, at least, but you know the city. Could you give us an example of these issues you are discussing in relation to Rotterdam? Where did we find this de-urbanization in Rotterdam?
I don't know enough. A city is a tough nut to crack. Isn't that a great expression? You know, as a foreigner, you're not meant to use expressions. No, I really mean that. You have to really know your city. I know London very well. I know Paris very well. I do not know Rotterdam. But what I think Rotterdam has, like I think it's a critical value, is enormous diversity of talents, of knowledges, of histories, you know, and but I cannot talk about it. I know that I serve on the international board, but I'm learning every time I come. So I cannot really make pronouncements. I know that I was trying to launch a little project when I was here for the last meeting, which was I have this project going in New York, open sourcing the neighborhood, connecting neighborhood. By neighborhoods I mean modest setup, modest communities. Connecting, how can their knowledge circulate and reach the center? They know something, every neighborhood resident knows something about the city that the center does not know. How can we make use of that? How can we make them feel my knowledge matters, etc.? So this is a project that I thought about with Rotterdam, and I walked through some of these modest neighborhoods, but it was clear that it was, one has to live in the city, you know, to get it. Cities
you talked about, for example, the big project, the high rises. In Rotterdam, we have a kind of love-hate relationship with big towers. Some people find it fantastic and tend to call it Manhattan aan de Maas, which is obviously ridiculous. But and others think it's.
But some high towers are wonderful. I like density. What I'm trying to make is another kind of distinction. Not all density urbanizes, huh? So that is, but I think we want great buildings, and you know, I'm not for. We don't want. No. But everything is a curve. At some point, it is on the other side of the curve, and it's something a bit different. So I like where I'm staying here, this whole area, which doesn't look like a Dutch city almost. You know, it's sort of all big buildings. It could indeed be in New York, but it's also exciting to have that. You know, I think a city is alive, but when that becomes, you know, these mega projects that eliminate a lot, and then, you know, it's a curve. At some point it becomes problematic.
Can you stand up and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Alias Tserat. I'm a geographer and artist, and I have two questions. And first is a bit more speculative about. So we live in a world where global population will probably reach 10 billion people, and 80%, or I don't remember the exact figure, is predicted to be living in a city. And connecting to your notion of this, not all the density actually urbanizes, or let's say the urbanization. What is the kind of form of the contemporary city, like on more macro scale? So is like trailer park the future of contemporary city? So this translated. And the second, like living as an artist in a city, I always have a feeling I live on the margin, and sort of I am the creator, let's say, of interesting living conditions in the city. So and I'm just thinking, like, what thoughts are you sharing on, for example, future alternative practices of living in city?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I have two sort of different vectors as part of the answer. One of them is something that I'm really very engaged by, which is the importance of relocalizing whatever we can, multinodal, in other words. So I'm especially always concerned about the more modest types of communities. So out with franchises, you know, why is Starbucks? Any franchise takes out part of the consumption capacity of a locality and takes it who knows where. So relocalize, I see that as a first step in mobilizing whatever talents are there. So I tell my students at Columbia University, if you need to buy shelves, bookshelves and tables, why go to IKEA to New Jersey? I'm at Columbia University. Go 10 blocks up and commission an immigrant. There's an immigrant community, and they know maybe a chair, you know, a chair is more delicate, but bookshelves and tables, hey. So that is sort of a thing about creating multiple nodes rather than everything being intermediated. So and another side of this, an illustration, is the data that we have is that, for instance, that the UK imports 10,000 tons of milk from France, and exports, and France imports the same more or less from, and there is one with Germany also, something like that. Now, if these were highly elaborate, if they were cheeses, I would say, of course, right, you want to, no, this is milk. So I stand back and I say, who wants this? Who needs this? Who benefits from this? The intermediary. So for me, one critical thing that is happening in our economy today is intermediation. Everything is intermediated. So I want to sort of minimize that. In that sense, the relocalizing. Huh? Now, at the other end, what kind of arrangements, dense, not dense, etc., given population growth? So, number one, I think we have to build new cities, and we better do it well. We cannot have the Sao Paulos where at the edges there are total spaces of misery. We simply have to build new cities, multinodal, etc., etc. You've all heard that the Chinese have decided on the huge 150 million zone because they are going so it's like a way of, actually it's better than it sounds. It's a way of disassembling, huh? So multiple nodes, a huge region, and I must say, when they did their, whatever it was, some big event, the Shanghai Expo, I was explicitly asked, I was visited by 3 very fancy Chinese, took me to a French restaurant, none of us could eat the food, they certainly couldn't, because it was very formal. And they asked me the following, they said, will you come and give a keynote lecture about the concept of a spatial unit that includes the rural and the urban. You understand where this is coming from, right? They don't want everybody just coming to the city. So in that sense, it sounds brutal, but it's not unintelligent. I think in a way, we've got to find units that encompass both. And then you bring in this relocalizing, etc., etc. Final point, little experiment that the London School of Economics Urban Age project did. They said, if we want to achieve a given density, in a high density, in a given size plot, the typical notion is a high tower. And they showed that you can achieve the same density by, instead of putting the thing in the middle, the edges, putting all the density at the edges. You get low, but everything, the circumference. Huh? So then you get lower buildings, but you get the same density. You don't need the tower in the middle. Now that to me sounds very interesting. And it means that in the center there is a notion also of some center, a park or whatever. You understand what I said, right? That all the buildings are, and you get a huge expansion in the surface that you can use within a given plot to create a certain level of density, rather than the tower in the middle. We just simply go mindlessly for the tower in the middle, which creates, that urban space very often, etc., if it's poorly done. Now, I want to emphasize that I like tall buildings. I don't want you to think that I like everything low and flat. No, but it has to be interesting. It has to work with the city. Huh?
About you mentioned the relocalizing. We have Arthur Nijhuis present from Rechtstreeks, which is a company, or I can call it a company, right? Which is a company that tries to shorten the food chain and bring together producers and consumers. Is this the type of company we need to give a counterweight to the developments?
We need this as a culture, which includes a company, consumers, transport, negotiations. We need local currencies. Why do we have to always use our credit card? Let's use, that there are about 180 cities that are using local currencies. Very partial. But that's one way in which you build up. So this is exiting this extreme intermediation. The global city function, the negative function, is intermediation. People always misunderstood that book of mine. They think that it is about all firms wanting to be. No, it's intermediation. The intermediate sector cannot lose. The two other sides might lose. So I think that this is disintermediation in my view, right? You make that's relocalizing, etc., etc. I think that's excellent. And there is a lot of that happening, but we should do more of it. And I think local currencies, I'm not talking Bitcoin, I'm talking like little paper, the more it gets used, no matter how partial, the more you build also a sort of a tissue of trust, of you know that you're doing. There are many, as I go around the world, there are many very interesting things that are happening in that sense. I mean, they're very, very partial still, no doubt about that, but I love that. And I would love to see if you have documents, etc. This is something that is really exploding, I would say, on the scene. I mean, Brooklyn, which is a place where when I was doing my work on sweatshops, goes back, they were more making it there, some of the garments, but they would put in the labels made in Taiwan. Today, parts of Brooklyn have become very fancy, admittedly. They make their own chocolate, and it is the chicest chocolate to have in London. Chocolate made in Brooklyn. I mean, they're just, this is now an extreme, this already enters another zone. But it's sort of fun also, this notion. And the chocolates are really weird. No, you should try them.
We have a couple of social entrepreneurs from Rotterdam on the front row. Sarah Rach from Drift, Dutch Research Institute for Sustainable Transitions.
So I work for Drift, the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, and we see transitions as a really fundamental change of organizing and doing things. I was wondering if you think that the civil society, as these local entrepreneurs, are a big enough counterforce for this marketization and capitalization of what is going on in our cities, or do we need also top-down management from the state as well?
It's not enough. I'm sure of that. What we need is a kind of a whole mix of elements. Our political classes, everybody here, political class excluded, are not doing their homework. They are not ready to, like when in the United States, which is the extreme case, you know this, right? I don't need to elaborate on that, but finance, it's too complex. So we delegated to whom? To the financial sector. Telecommunications, too complex. So that is no way to have a political class. There is homework to be done, and you know what? Like Elizabeth Warren is a person who does her homework, right? Who knows the stuff, that particular thing that she knows. So we must do much more, and we cannot do it without the state in all its instances. I think it's a missed opportunity if we just try to do it on ourselves. Now we can start, the leadership of cities is often more accessible. So Bristol, I don't know if anybody has been in Bristol. Bristol has a great mayor who is an architect who always wears red pants. He's known as the red pant mayor. And he has developed a local currency. He uses it for everything that he can, but it is not absolute. We are intermeshed. There is no such thing as closing yourself up. But he's a very good example. And he never fails to mention you can launch your own local currency. It's a very partial domain, maybe 30% of what but it has all kinds of other functions. It's not just about the commercial transaction.
You are in the International Advisory Board for Rotterdam. This is the advice you give to Mayor Abu Taleb as well when you're meeting him? Start up a local currency, or what is the biggest advice you have for the mayor?
I don't know Rotterdam. So I don't know, but I have not talked with him about it. No, I have not.
There is one already.
There is one. There you go. See, often it starts in a local. So what does it tell us about it?
A couple of them actually, right? But not started up by the mayor.
No, but the mayor of Bristol is unusual. Well, I think Abu Taleb is also unusual. But to be pursued, I want to hear also. I would love to hear about this.
I would love to tell you more, but I know it's called the Dam, but I don't know that one.
The Dam. Are there any people from the local currency right here? Because they are quite active in the public debate as well. Not tonight. Okay. Please introduce yourself.
My name's Claire. I'm an architect from Toronto, but I'm finishing a postgraduate degree at the Berlage Institute. And so I think, my question is more, is there really actually a difference between the actual buying out of corporate space versus the public development of space in the form of superblocks? Because I think that many cities
when the government does it, you
mean?
mean?
Because I think I've recently done research in Seoul, and also my current work is in Marseille, and Marseille is introducing its first superblock scale of development in a city in which that's a completely foreign concept. And even though that's driven in some ways by the city, albeit through a somewhat private body within the city, it may be public land. but you end up in some ways with the same result, where you end up with a kind of scale of development in which the property is so tightly controlled that it ends up being effectively private.
Yeah, no, I think you've said it, because I think that, you know, there are leaderships, city leaderships, who are really, they are not necessarily, it doesn't matter, they might as well be corporates, you know. So I think that that's also happening. Moreover, we in the United States have many cities who have managers. They are not even mayors, but they run the city. They are the equivalent of the mayor. But you certainly have a lot of, what I also find, I must say, that there are more and more mayors of big cities, in other words, that one can get to know them, which are really good. You know, this is truly a transformation. It used to be that a mayor could be a rather dodgy character, you know? And now, I mean, you really have mayors who, and I think partly that is a function that a lot of governance obligations that used to happen within the national state have now scaled down to the level of cities, both small and big, but it's especially visible in big cities, partly because of privatization and deregulation. You know, it's a sort of irony. But these policies that begin to be launched 30 years ago or something in more and more parts of the world, certainly in the West, actually means that stuff doesn't disappear, but it moves to the city level. And when you look at the climate change issue, I mean, cities are absolutely in the forefront. You know, national governments can keep on talking, but local governments have got to deal with the fact of flood, with whatever it might be. I was at a meeting in Rio. You can sit down. I was at a meeting. Well, if you sit down, I can talk about Rio. So 2 years ago, it was a prep meeting for the Paris, and so it was mayors from all over the world were there. No national government had arrived yet, so to speak. And they could just talk across totally different worlds, you know, because they have very practical problems that they share. And a kind of discourse has developed among mayors. And then when the summit of mayors was done, arrived the national governments. And they totally regressed, I must say, to the usual thing, you know, that they didn't want to lose. I mean, rather than addressing practical problems, it was, you know, what am I going to get out of this, and I don't want to give too much. So it was truly a marked difference. I must say this meeting was a bit better, the Paris meeting, than that.
Hi, I'm Mona. I study in urban management and development, and as an urban designer, I have a question tonight from you. Actually, you refer to city as complex and incomplete system, and based on the concept of resiliency, which related to top-up and bottom-up movement in the city, when we want to answer to your question that who own the city, what would be the answer if we want to counter these two group of people in the city, like the emergence of self-organizing bottom-up movement, and also the power of top-up organizations in the city?
What we should say? Well, I mean, first, I think resilience is a limited concept. We have to understand. So when I give my environmental talk, resilience is very generic. Sure, you can bring in a lot beneath that. But to me, for instance, the work that I'm doing on the environmental question and is with material science people, with biologists. You know, there is a world of opportunities. And I always say every surface in a city should be working. As an example, I love this. So this is a university in Copenhagen, and Delft is doing some other version of this. A biologist discovered that a bacterium you put it in brown waters, you know, like what we produce in kitchens, bathrooms, etc. So it's organic. Can produce a molecule of a plastic, durable, resistant, but biodegradable. That is what I'm interested in when it comes to the environmental issue rather than resilience. Resilience is a very fancy word. I'm sick of it, I confess. I hope I don't offend anybody. A growing movement is sick of it. I'm not alone in that. Because it becomes a category. Not the term itself is a beautiful word, but you know what it stands for. It's too easy. So back to the bacterium. That means that what is now a burden, for most cities, it costs money, how you're going to do it, suddenly becomes a positive. You either export the prime matter, materia prima, the organic brown waters, or you export the plastic. Durable, resistant, biodegradable, that's pretty good. Then there are in Delft, so I've had students working with these people, so I sent them for the summer, that they because it takes a lot of effort actually. In Delft, they're developing polymers, it's another version of plastic in a way, that are also biodegradable. Now, this is the stuff, this is what we need. Material science people, amazing. Or this Dutchman that made the news, who said if we could collect the heat produced by our computers, right? And he developed something to collect it. That is what I'm interested in. Now, most people are talking resilience, and I think that's great. But I think we need to go much further than that. So my basic thing is every surface in the city should be working. The return of wood, using wood, not painting the wood. The wood knows how to handle the changes of. I mean, why are you going to paint it if it's on the outside, maybe on the inside? But I was part of the IBA, this big project in Hamburg, 7 years. I served on the board. And so we launched 60 international competitions. And it was all about how do we use, the knowledge of material science. Amazing things. The algae, the mushrooms, the bacteria, etc. So to me, that is the frontier here. It's much more complex than a lot of what I hear. I don't mean to be brutal here, but so I think resilience is a great word, and what is happening beneath the label of resilience is welcome. All I'm saying is my heart and my head are not there. I am just in another, and of course I'm at a university which has all of that, they have a great material science department. Material science is amazing what they are also doing, well, I am not going to give you my lecture on material science now.
Next question, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Poonam. I am a student of urban development management here in Rotterdam. I come from India. I'm here for a year now to do this course. I'm a government officer back in India. So for the past few years, I have been seeing a lot of changes by globalization, that globalization has brought about in the cities. But I also see, and this was a very insightful lecture of yours today, actually. And I see the differences of globalization between the developed countries and the developing countries.
Yeah.
And the impacts are different, actually.
Yeah.
What you said, like, for example, the middle class is shrinking in the maybe the developed countries, but in developing countries it is a different case. Actually, the middle class is increasing. So how do you view the the globalization processes in the developing countries?
Well, this notion of the middle class is growing. I mean, there is China, let me start with China, and then I'll say India, and then I'll say a few others. So China, is the core data set to argue that more and more, that I don't know how many people have gotten out of poverty. Because why? Because suddenly they have an income, right? So this is, you understand, this is my problem. In the expulsions I deal with all of these measures, the way we measure stuff. So then you have to ask, well, maybe they're monetized, they have a monetized income, but they're getting poorer, and that's exactly what we're seeing in China now. That those poor people who had zero income because they were just living off the land, so they get an income and they looks like eliminate poverty, millions, we're talking millions and millions, right, out of poverty. Mostly China accounts for half of all of those who got out of poverty in this last whatever. But they are totally poor. They used to have a patch of land. So it's bifurcated. Some have done very well, and others have done very terribly bad. So we have to take that very carefully. Now, take countries like Nigeria, an expanded middle class, fairly well educated, a lot of wealth, but a mass of people who are left out. We know that, right? And so this notion that the developed world is doing better. Now, India has, like an upper middle class that has really thrived in a way that, and then it has a middle class that has also grown, but you still have a vast amount of poverty, correct or not? No, you don't have poverty? Yeah, okay. Now, then I go back So in expulsions, I ask myself this question, but say for Somalia, a lot of the sub-Saharan African countries in the 1960s, independence wars, Somalia had, they had a dictator. But boy, did they have an educated middle class, a professional class. They had good institutions, and now look what Somalia. So when you begin to look at some of the sub-Saharan African countries, there was a period, and by the way, another datum. So I looked, for instance, what was foreign investment at that point? We know that today most foreign investment is for extractive, agriculture, water, or mining, right? Well then, it was in manufacturing, and manufacturing has a real capacity to produce a middle class. That's also the story of China. Oh, yeah, China more than India, maybe. So today, a lot of the African countries have really bifurcated. Luanda has just joined. I have this image that I have of these geographies of centrality that cut across north, south, east, west, and that don't have to do much with national territory. They're very so. Luanda, capital of Angola, has just joined the club. Right now, Luanda is being built up as a mini global city with everything that you need. Luxury this, luxury that. So what's happening there? Well, corporations and entities that are moving there. There is a vast amount of natural wealth in Angola that has not been exploited. Now, if you look at GDP per capita, this looks like Angola is really doing well. The same thing has happened with the land grabs. When a big corporation, so there's this other work that I've done, right? 220 million hectares that we have counted have been bought, minimum size 200 hectares by about 100 firms in about 15 countries. And when they eliminate all the smallholder agriculture, which has cultures, knowledge in it, you know what I'm talking about, right? Smallholders, they know how to deal with this stuff. GDP per capita, and they replace it with a plantation, which will kill the land very quickly. Plantation is not good for land. You make it very elementary, right? Well, but GDP per capita, it goes like that. So this brings us back to the measures that we use. This is a big issue for me. So people like Joseph Stiglitz, who is a colleague of mine, and Amartya Sen, of course, have long been working on, we need to change the indicators. The indicators we have do not quite allow us to see what is happening. The indicators worked very well after World War II, mass consumption, mass manufacturing. The middle was the dominant form. Today, when the extremes are the dominant form, these averages don't tell us a tale, you see. So, I mean, to me, this is an issue. But certainly a lot of jobs have been created in China, in India. It is a transformed economy, but it's not as good as it sounds. That's my only concern.
We have, I think, time for 2 more questions.
And then I need a drink.
And I would, Anna...
to provide that.
And we also have Annette van Otterlo from Freehouse present.
No, it's okay.
Annette? Okay, she might be at the bar already.
I have water. I meant to drink.
Go ahead.
He brought me water. I got my drink.
This was what you meant? A glass of water?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm Jay. I'm a proud citizen of this beautiful city we call Rotterdam.
It is a great city.
Yeah, it is a great city, yes. Yeah. I've got 2 questions and 1 statement before the questions.
Okay, start with the most important.
And what else? Nothing else? Nothing else?
The problems you have in your lecture, I think it's a thing of the capitalistic system that's not working or maybe working, but I'm not sure if I'm pro capitalism or not. But what I see is that the big rich people, they have they buy, as you see, foreign people, foreign corporations, they buy stuff and they buy stuff. And
stuff,
yeah,
right.
Stuff, especially.
Good word,
stuff, yeah.
huh? Spullen.
Spullen, dingen.
Dingen.
And they
there's a question coming, right?
There's a question coming, but so I'm not sure if the capitalistic system is working or not. But my first question is the interest for buying for foreign corporates or countries, is the interest in buying Chinese or Saudi property or grounds or rural grounds. Is it big or not? The interest. Do they buy?
The Saudis and the
Yeah, no, the Saudis and the Chinese, the foreign countries that
Yeah.
buy a lot of
Yeah.
property and land
they
in
buy.
the Western countries. Do they sell to Western countries as well? Is
Oh,
it-
so it's not only your question is it's not only the Saudis and the Chinese buying stuff in London stuff again. Yeah,
But
sorry.
also that, well, you know, I showed you the let me go back to this table that ooh, where were we? Yeah, here. So this is buying. This is buying very fancy homes. So as you can see, I love this one here in Shanghai, like the world is buying in Shanghai. But I have there is another slide there, which is Hong Kong. The main buyers of property in Hong Kong are mainland Chinese. So when you look at Shanghai, look at that. Hong Kong, Taiwanese, US, Canadian, Korean, Singapore, Australia, Japanese, Malaysian, German, French. They're all buying in Shanghai. And then it shows Hong Kong, which I realize it doesn't show here. Hong Kong, mainland Chinese. That's all. So that shows you something also. You understand what I'm saying, right? So the buying, I mean, this is a commercial culture. You know, there are some restrictions, you know, but people buy. I mean, entities buy. These are people or these are corporations. So there is a lot of buying going on. But this, and buying, you know, properties in a foreign city, this is an old history. But this is a particular phase. That is why, you know, and it's sort of escalating, and it's often sitting there. It's underutilized. Actually, the density of population in some of these cities is actually diminishing. The visual order suggests growing density, but a lot of it is empty. So there's actually a reduction in density, which is, for some people, problematic. But it is so extreme. That is why I'm looking at it. I'm not the only one.
Yeah, I understand you have one more question, but I'm going to give that opportunity to someone else. But it has to be the most interesting question until now, because it's the last one. Okay, you're very enthusiastic over there, so we are expecting a lot. Please stand up and introduce yourself then.
Hello, I'm Stella Boas from TU Delft. And I don't know if it's the most interesting, but at least it's something that hasn't been addressed, I think. And if it's irrelevant, we can pass on it quickly. So my question is about citizens, because we've mentioned social entrepreneurs, and I've witnessed some co-creation.
Citizens, I showed you all the stuff on citizens. We're losing rights. Yes.
That's right. So I've witnessed some co-creation projects in Rotterdam. I'm looking at how to empower people who live in social housing, for example. And the thing that I really notice is that it's very hard for them to think on a larger scale. So the things that you're presenting are all on a macro scale. And it's really, really hard for them to think on an even higher scale than the neighborhood. So do you have any suggestions, any tips? Because apart from the social entrepreneurs who develop maybe a neighborhood, what would you recommend for citizens? What could they do?
I was addressing that when I said about relocalizing. What I didn't mention is and the open sourcing, you know, the knowledge that they have, and I see those all as first steps in trajectories that I don't know where they go, but once mobilized. And the third element that I did not mention is a project that I did for Open Society, which is to look at apps, not commercial, but more apps that were generated by activists, by doctoral students, that kind of thing, to enable the work life and the neighborhood life of low-income spaces and people. And very interesting stuff. And again, I see that as sort of mobilizing. So just to give you just a little example, one of these apps is called the Emergency Nanny. The Emergency Nanny is a little app that anybody can click on. You have a crisis, and you have selected who they are, 7 people, 8 people, mostly people who are stable in the neighborhood. You're on the workplace, in a low-wage workplace, You don't get to pull out your telephone and make 7 calls to find out who can help me with my crisis back home. And if you leave the job, you lose your job. I mean, it's a brutal zone. But what you can do is just quickly click, click on the emergency nanny. And you select people who are stable in the neighborhood. The hairdresser, the butcher, I mean, whether you want the butcher to deal with your kids or it's another matter, but But the point here is that, to me, that is just a little instrumentality, but it does 2 functions. It begins to connect neighborhood with workplace. That is something low wage people need. The neighborhood has got to be a social backup system. I'm talking about I'm talking about people who are pretty extreme. But secondly, it means that the butcher says, the hairdresser says, I'm not just the butcher, I'm not just the hairdresser, I can actually help. There are other, tissue begins to be made. I think what we have lost a lot in this hyper-consumption sort of mode is tissue that connects us, that we need each other a bit, and that is why this relocalizing for me is extremely important. And my position also is a bit that, look, there's only so much we can do about, say, criticizing the big corporates. I think it's crucial that we focus on how we can transform our communities. Each, I actually use the language of neighborhood because community, is heavy duty word. So I am and this is a growing interest, but the United States is very extreme. So this notion of relocalizing, of urban agriculture, these are all very, very partial, local currencies, but we don't know where they go. These are trajectories. There are certain neighborhoods which are setting up cooperatives again. There's a famous cooperative in Brooklyn that has worked for 20 years, which is amazing because mostly they go down, And so, to me, this is extremely interesting. It's very difficult to track. There are also around health issues, same thing, the sort of collaborating. There are always people who are willing to give some of their time, etc., like doctors. I know a great guy at Columbia University who makes a point of spending time. And it's not just about the service, it's about bringing people together, it's about saying we can help each other, in the Netherlands, I must say, when my mother had cancer, she was living in Amsterdam Zuid. Anyhow, so then the doctor said, okay, now why don't you just go home and die at home? It didn't quite say it that way, but she did die. But as soon as she got home, suddenly I happened to be visiting her. There was a neighborhood system where suddenly there were people who rotated, sort of that the neighborhood. You must know about this or not? I think that is brilliant. So there was always somebody there available, and somebody would come at night, check with her during the day. Sort of a neighborhood capability. These are very important little elements. We have got to get more of that. We've got to strengthen, those possibilities. That solves only maybe 30% of the issues, so that leaves 70% still out there. So the other one is the political classes. They've got to, start working. I exempt everybody present here, okay? No, all you political classes, you're just great here in the room. But I don't know, I'm thinking of the United States, which is the extreme case. But have we sort of done it, you think, for the evening?
You're really desperate for that drink, right?
I have 2 days of no sleep.
Okay.
I arrived this morning from the US.
When are you flying to Ankara?
I have a flight at 7 a.m. but tomorrow.
In the morning, right? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have to leave at 4 a.m. But not tomorrow morning.
Okay. So, how's your Dutch?
Ja, ik spreek het wel met een hele zachte G. Limburg en Brabant. Nee, maar ik heb het nooit gestudeerd, ik heb het nooit leren schrijven, nooit leren lezen. So het is keuken-Nederlands dat ik spreek. Hè?
Met
mijn ouders moesten wel.
Gaat u nog oefenen de komende...
Oefenen?
Hier in Rotterdam? Beetje de Rotterdamse tongval aanleren?
Nee, dat probeer ik niet eens. Nee. That sounds like a real challenge,
Well, you might pick some up at the bar. Thank you a lot for being here, and please a warm applause for Saskia Sassen.